Welcome, everyone, to the panel. It's lovely to have so many folks with us. And thanks so much for the invitation from the Office of the Privacy Commission for us to join you from across the Tasman and for one of our panelists from across the Pacific, actually. My name is Kate Henna, and I'm a professor at the Australian National University, where I serve as director of the School of Regulation and Global Governance. Basically, that's a mouthful to say our school is really committed to improving and enhancing how we regulate, how we govern complicated issues like data and privacy. And our goal really is to minimize domination and inequalities in the world. So that's our mandate as a school. We've been around for 20 years doing that, and we really look forward to hearing from you all to help us with that mission. I also lead the Justice and Technoscience Lab, and all the speakers are affiliates of the lab. And our collaborative work aims to really identify the unintended consequences of technological innovation so that we can develop stronger responses to addressing lived experiences of harm and inequity. So I'll be facilitating our conversation today, and I will chime in a bit occasionally and invite others to ask questions as well. That said, before we begin, I should note that I am zooming in from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And as many panelists are also joining us from here, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these unceded lands and pay my respects to elders past and present. The continuing cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples not only highlight their enduring connections to the lands of this continent, as Maori people do in your part of the world, but they also have contributed to broader innovations and collaboration with other First Nations peoples regarding how to address and actually redress longstanding concerns about inequitable approaches to data and its use, with surveillance and concerns around privacy being part of that wider package. So just as one example of those really important innovations in this space are the wider efforts around the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. And I'll just add this to the chat so others can access it. This is a collection from scholars who really wanted to make something open access and available for others to understand some of those emergent efforts in that space. It's not a comprehensive guide to that space, but it's certainly an invitation. So our discussion today focuses on concerns of privacy and power as they arise at the intersections of data and racial inequality. It showcases researchers who have studied areas of climate justice, criminal justice, gender violence, and humanitarianism in Australasia, the Middle East, North America, and the Pacific. We've structured the panel as a conversation today amongst our speakers first, so we can use their insights as a starting point for thinking about two key concerns. First, on better understanding as well as challenging the ways that data can replicate and reinforce racial inequality. And then second, to help us think through how privacy can support more equitable outcomes. We'll of course then open it up to questions and feedback from others. And this session builds on a special issue that we worked on for the Journal of Big Data and Society. All of that's open access. I'm happy to share it in the chat if others are interested. And that really grounds our foundational thinking around these issues. So before we do intros to the panelists, and we're going to actually let them introduce themselves and their work together, I want to hand over to my co-editor, Renee Shelby, to provide a little bit more information about some of those ideas and how they'll inform what we'll discuss today. Over to you, Renee.
Thanks, Kate. And I'm so excited to see so many people have joined. Just really thrilled so many folks are interested in this. So just a little bit of background about the special issue, and we'll be sure to drop in a link to it. But the issue invited researchers to think through how data and data practices, meaning how data is collected, what it's meant to represent, who owns it, how it's used, how that can tell us something about inequality, and especially racial inequality. So data, and particularly big data, is often thought of as just a neutral representation of the world, that it's the snapshot of society as is. And we really wanted to help push back against that false assumption and examine how people use data to tell stories about the social world, particularly focusing on those who have the most social and political capital. So how do those people who are in those positions of power use data, and for what ends? And so we specifically focused on this issue of racial inequality and how that intersects with ideas about gender identity, sexuality, income and class, and health, And one of the big themes that emerged, and which will come up today in our panel conversation, is that social ideas about race are baked into the collection and use of data, even when race is not explicitly collected in the data set. So what does that mean? So racial identity may not be a variable in a data set, but the social ideas about race still show up in the data and in how data can be used to respond to particular social problems, whether that's COVID-19 public policies, how low-income charter schools use data to garner funding, how landlords make use of tenant databases, how police respond to sexual assault and other types of crime. So those are some of the case studies that we talked about in the special issue, and just kind of showcase how race is central to data and how people make use of it. So we want to continue that conversation here and paying attention to how data is collected, how it's used, how it flows through institutions, and how we can use that lens to examine how power flows through institutions and which communities stand to benefit from that. So I just felt like I talked a lot. So I want to turn it over now to this panel, and we invite all the panelists who are experts on their various areas to weigh in, and I'll pass it back to Kate.
Great, thanks, Renee. We might just go around and let everyone introduce themselves and their topic. And so I'll work from my screen, which I think looks like everyone else's. So Kanika, do you want to kick us off with an introduction to yourself?
Certainly. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kate and Renee. I'm Kanika Samuels-Wortley, and I'm an assistant professor at Carleton University, which is located in Ottawa, Canada, and is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm also a fellow at RegNet, and today I'm joining you all from the Ngunnawal country. So my research explores how race and racism influence the function of the criminal justice system in Canada, with a particular focus on policing. So at present, I'm exploring the use of AI technologies and like predictive policing programs and how they may maintain police procedures that see the over-surveillance of historically marginalized communities.
Great, thanks so much. Jenna?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Imad Harb, and thank you so much for having me here today, where I'm joining from the Darawal land. I'm a PhD student here at the Australian National University at the School of Regulation and Global Governance. And very broadly, my areas of research are surveillance, data governance, and automated and digital technologies, with a specific focus on the experiences of marginalized groups. My doctoral research examines the role of technology in social assistance and humanitarian systems in Lebanon, and to make sense of broader global shifts in the digitization of welfare programming, I'm studying digital cash transfers to refugees and emergency response to the Beirut port explosion.
Great, thanks. And certainly, last but certainly not least, Kirsty?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Kirsty Nantharaja, and today I'm zooming in from Gadigal land. I'm a PhD student at RegNet at the ANU, and my thesis research looks into climate finance in Fiji. And in particularly, I'm interested in whether climate finance is actually operating as a mechanism of climate justice. My work focuses in on various inequalities that are actually manifesting at the grassroots in Fiji. And this includes the use of data in projects like renewable energy resource mapping and investment mapping of the Pacific region. Thank you.
Terrific, thanks so much. And it'll be great to hear the diversity of your perspectives on this issue, as it is an unwieldy topic. So why don't we kick off with just a general question about, what does privacy look like in the spaces that you research? Because obviously, and I'm sure people that work with privacy issues every day know it can look very different in different contexts. The issues that people experience can vary greatly. And given your various areas of expertise, obviously, we're going to see variation across that. So Jenna, I thought we might start with you just because you actually work with people on the ground who are subject to surveillance and in very vulnerable positions where they may or may not have a say over what data is collected about them.
Yes, absolutely. So in my research, what I often see is this idea of privacy as being transactional. So there's this widespread belief amongst practitioners that if you're economically poor and you need public assistance like cash or food, those recipients are obligated to exchange and sacrifice their privacy for this assistance. And what I mean by that is that welfare applicants are compelled to provide detailed demographic information, biometric data like iris scans and fingerprints, and they have to submit to various forms of surveillance, such as the tracking of their purchases. So in this welfare space and in the humanitarian space, privacy and human rights are treated as if they're tradable or they can't happen simultaneously. But those who are less vulnerable, less marginalized, and less dependent on public assistance don't experience such intimate levels of monitoring and tracking. So it's really important to recognize that this transactional thinking about privacy really justifies limits to privacy for those who are at the margins.
Great, thanks for that. Kanika, we'll throw to you next.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in the context of the criminal justice system, numerous research has demonstrated that racial and ethnic communities are more likely to draw police attention. So in this context, privacy is seen as a form of privilege because those who reside within and navigate the spaces that receive more police attention are more likely then to draw state surveillance, as the police are an arm and an extension of the state. So in the context of AI technologies and the use of predictive policing technologies, many of these technologies use historical data to help train, inform the data that will be drawn from these programs. So if the idea is that this is being based on racial bias and historical racial bias and attention, then the idea is that it's going to simply maintain racial bias, even though the idea is it's predicting where areas or persons who may commit crime, but it really is just using racially biased data in order to produce areas that the police are meant to deploy their resources. So the concern is that, in essence, this can be, once again, creating a level of inequity in terms of who is protected and whose privacy is protected in comparison to those who simply are going to be maintained, the maintenance of surveillance is maintained.
Yeah, great, Kanika. That's a great parallel to talk about, from individual privacy to collective privacy when things get deployed in that way. Renee, you've done some related work on criminal justice, or at least responses to crime. Do you want to pick up some any other pieces of how it emerges in your area?
Yeah, so just quickly, I study gender violence, and my background is working in and with nonprofits and organizations that respond to gender violence, particularly youth. And with that, I spent a lot of time working in the juvenile legal system. And then later, when I went to grad school, I studied technologies that people create to respond to sexual violence and gender violence. So like wearable panic buttons, apps that you can use to report assault, different technologies that the police use. So in that gender violence context, I think I have probably the most traditional understanding of privacy happening there, which is really about confidentiality of data. So this means like data or information about survivors, about perpetrators, about acts of violence, kind of respecting that information, making sure identifiable information is not revealed, and trying to kind of restore that agency back to survivors who have lost that through the non-consensual assault. All assault's not consensual. That understanding of privacy, I think, is really driven by the perspective of victim advocates and rape crisis centers. So survivors come to them for help and they've experienced that loss of agency. So privacy is about trying to respect and restore that. I think this can get really complicated in trying to do that once laws come in and when people are working with different institutions. So in the US, there's very particular laws around mandatory reporting that compel the sharing of information about survivors, and they compel the sharing of information with the police. And in the US, criminal legal system survivors do not drive that process. Police and prosecutors do. So once police get involved, survivors once again lose agency over that information and their privacy, and it gets kind of taken up by the system. And once you introduce technologies and data in there, it becomes even more complicated.
Great, really interesting. And Kirsty, you do work in the Pacific, which, you know, I think given the type of work that you're doing on climate finance might actually challenge us to think about privacy in other ways. Do you mind elaborating on that just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the concept of privacy is challenged in various ways in my research on climate finance. And maybe I'll just step back and give a bit of context. So climate finance is one way that climate justice can be enacted. And it sees the flows and the transfer of resources from developed countries to developing countries that are feeling the existential effects of climate change disproportionately. So these flows of finance are, essentially the key part of climate finance. And there are various technologies that seek to track those flows and make those flows easier. And one of these technologies is using, I guess, data on the recipient countries, so countries in the global south that need climate resources urgently, is to use data on them, which produces things like renewable energy resource maps, which shows the availability of renewable energy resources of particular communities and places in the Pacific, and also investment maps that show how attractive communities are for investment. So if we problematize these technologies, we see that, I guess, the beings needing protection and privacy aren't the individual per se, it's the community. And it can even be land where representations can be problematic. So privacy in the context of this is a bit tricky because it sees us, expanding the concepts beyond, the personal and the individual. And, in the Pacific, with such strong relational ties and such strong, governance and relationships with land, that information surrounding community and land can be just as intimate and just as sensitive and just, as worthy of protection.
Yeah, great points, Kirsty, and things that might challenge some of our existing frameworks, at least in Australia, where we have very limited kinds of privacy protections that certainly wouldn't resonate in that context. So given that our panel is going to talk, we want to highlight some issues around racial inequality, I guess I just wanted to ask the panel, what forms of racial inequality have you observed in your work? And since you've all talked about data in different ways, maybe also the role that data has played in them. And Renee, we might start with you because you've talked about some of that already, and how you see privacy in relation to victim survivors. So we might kick off with you first.
Yeah. So kind of for me, when thinking about like racial inequality and data and the topic of gender violence, I feel like you cannot take ideas about race out of the equation, especially when we look that historically, gender violence is a tool of racial inequality. It's not just about gender dynamics, it's about how gender intersects and interacts with things like race, nationality, sexuality, disability. And gender violence historically was a tool of colonialism, of war, and general expressions of power. And like race is just baked into there. So for me, you actually cannot have a social response to gender violence without grappling with that history and recognizing how it has shaped and continues to shape social ideas about gender violence. And that particularly hits those, kind of in those examples of who has the least social power. So like when we look in the US about who is most likely to experience these forms of violence, poor women, on the lower end of the income spectrum, Black women, Indigenous women, trans women, people who are experiencing like compounding levels of inequality and oppression in their daily lives becomes the target. And so looking at some of the technologies to respond to gender violence, they try to take race out of the equation and don't actively collect any information about that and try to become race neutral in a way. You know, it's kind of just about these other set of facts. And so it creates this illusion of you have this race neutral data and kind of this race neutral understanding of the problem that is completely disconnected from how it's experienced in everyday life. And this is kind of interesting that these technologies do remove this, because they collect quite personal information, you know, gender, age, your home address, what you do, you know, they're really collecting this whole profile on you, except for this one aspect of identity and inequality that really kind of shapes the issue, which is just incongruent for me in my case.
Yeah, and we know that lots of other data tends to be collected on people who are poor and experience other forms of marginalization. So when that data can be triangulated, you know, privacy protections for the app may not resonate across wider fields. Great. Kanika, do you mind weighing in on that, since you're explicitly engaging those issues with communities in Canada?
Yeah, certainly. So to understand how AI technologies can exacerbate racial inequalities is to understand kind of the idea of the feedback loop when it comes to the training of AI tech, predictive policing programs. So often the data that's used is historical data to help train and decide where police should deploy their resources, the idea where crime will take place, who will commit crime. But once again, this is often based on racially biased data. And the idea is that if the police are deployed in areas based on whatever comes from the predictive policing program, if they are situated in areas and continue to be situated in areas that are identified as a place of criminogenic risks, there is the idea that it's going to continuously feed similar data back into the system, and once again will regurgitate historical biases in areas that commit crime and who commits crime. So this is where we will see racial inequalities, because it simply is continuing to maintain historical biases that we have seen in the past. We will continue to see police in the same areas. Therefore, the idea that this is predicting crime is problematic, because it really is just based on historical data. The concerns here are, and I'm speaking from the Canadian context, is that for a very long time, we have denied the existence of racism in our country. So we are finally having that discussion that many social institutions have systemic racism, and the barriers that have been placed on people of color, Black and Indigenous peoples in our country is a result of experiences with racism. And the fear is now that we are going into using technologies to decide where the police should be deployed, it then takes away responsibility from individual and racialized and racially biased decisions. The fear is that now decisions are being taken away from the individual officer and claiming that it is objective based on AI tech trained programs. And the concern is that we will then start to no longer have the conversation about racial bias in our country, and simply claim that it is based on it's bias, it's based on these programs. So what I'm concerned about is that we will no longer, or we will not have meaningful conversations of the impact that systemic racism has had in our country, considering that we really are just starting to have those conversations.
Yeah, really interesting. And the fact that when you bring in automation, it also makes things opaque. So we actually don't know what kind of data is often used in those, in part because they're protected by trade secrets or proprietary software, depending on what those, contracts look like. So, analogous to privacy in the personal space, we might think about what transparency can do in this space as well. Those are great points, Kanika. Kirsty, I'd love to hear a little bit more from your context about how these things emerge.
Absolutely. In my context, it's very much a situation of racial formation being, it's latent, it's not very obvious. And I might just work through an example of that. So climate finance, as we mentioned before, flows from developed to developing countries. And developed countries often set the terms or the metrics for the flows of that finance. So in, I guess, the resource mapping and the investment mapping, one thing that's often represented is this idea of risk. So how risky is place A as an investment, for example? And often risk is something that can be very much racially coded. So for something to be risky, or a place to be risky, they might have a different way of governing land. For example, land might be under customary ownership, and this place is thus deemed risky. So if we're, looking at this map and we just see a particular place, denoted as risky, we tend to accept that label and we don't actually unpack it further and say, what is this word hiding? And essentially, this is, a way that difference is responded to. Often governance systems from the global south are deemed to be inferior to the northern best practice standard. And then we see these, benchmarks like risk or expertise, all sorts of things that we take for granted. The fact is that they actually have a racial history, and when we unpack that, we see deep inequality.
Great, thanks for that. Might shift gears to starting to think about what kinds of principles and values around privacy we think are important in the communities that you work in. And Jenna, again, I know you've done a lot of work with refugee populations and other places in Lebanon and the Middle East. And so it'd be great to know what you think, what kinds of principles and values around privacy do you see as important for the communities you work with? And I should note that's a very large community if we think about refugees more generally.
Absolutely. It's a phenomenal question. And what I really found from speaking to refugees and migrant laborers was that privacy was only one of these concerns that these groups had when it came to questions of data protection, data security. So really, in my experience on the ground, it became very clear that focusing on privacy on its own can be an overly narrow and reductive frame. And it's really helpful, I think, to view privacy not as an isolated concept, but as fundamentally connected to other concerns. So what I mean by this is privacy has reciprocal relationships with parallel issues. And what really came out in my research was these issues are questions of trust, dignity, data justice, safety, and social inequality. And it's really common to approach all of these separate issues within their own silos. And as my brilliant colleague Renee pointed out the other day, this is just an artifact of how giant bureaucracies actually operate. So bureaucratic processes often respond to a narrow issue and then filter it out. But in practice, this approach actually ignores relationships and connections between related concerns. So for our purpose today, conversations about inequity are sometimes happening outside of conversations about privacy, even though privacy is fundamentally a social inequity issue. So basically, in summary, I just want to highlight that it's important to connect privacy to other concepts and to get it out of its silo.
Great, great. And actually, Renee, you might have some complementary or different thoughts on that, given the places that you've worked. Do you mind sharing some ideas around that?
Yeah. So this connects, I think, to my last comment, which that within this realm of gender violence, and actually, I think it's probably just pretty common in general, is that people think about privacy through that individual frame, especially in technology. And so we just kind of see this play out in trying to protect PII or personally identifiable information. So through that kind of narrower individualizing lens of privacy, it's about de-identifying information, hashing out names or addresses or blurring faces or kind of other aspects of a body. And that misses how privacy is more a set of norms, especially around who gets to own data and then perhaps sell or broker it or move it around to other systems, and how privacy in that sense can, I mean, weaponized is a strong word, but it can be leveraged or deployed to kind of maintain existing power dynamics or inequalities, especially when it comes around to like the ownership of data and controlling it. So for me, like, a vision of the future, or like what different values I would love to see around privacy, is thinking of it as a system of ideas, norms, laws, kind of recognizing that is about these practices and looking at who is benefiting in who is maybe losing or benefiting less in that system. And maybe we can imagine a new privacy system that kind of shifts that around to shift that balance.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I know we're having discussions in Australia about changing our Privacy Act. I know New Zealand's been really proactive in terms of thinking through it as principles, but having these other kinds of conversations about how we might shift our existing legislation to enable those systems is really important. Kirsty, given that you've really highlighted so many different relational and communal aspects, as well as transnational ones, what are your thoughts around what different kinds of values or principles do you think are important for the communities you work with?
I think that, starts a broader conversation about agency and how, we're represented. And I think the issue in climate finance is that these data projects are essentially telling a story, right? They're telling a narrative. And those in power get to set the parameters of the narrative. For example, by mapping the Pacific in terms of what resources they have or their bankability or investability, we're framing the climate crisis as an opportunity to profit, not necessarily as a mandate for justice. And I wonder, how Pacific communities would like themselves to be represented in that, because I know internationally they are significant advocates for climate justice and have had a very loud voice on the international arena. And I wonder how that would, translate to this conversation. So I think, some of the principles and values that I see being key in my research is essentially agency and thinking about who gets to tell the story.
Great, thanks. And actually all the questions or points that you've all raised really have highlighted how privacy extends to these broader issues of power. And so we might shift directions in that way. And just ask kind of like, what kinds of things do you think need to be in place when collecting and using data if we want to meaningfully address these issues of racial inequality? And some of you've already alluded to it, but I think it'd be helpful to kind of hit that point home. So I think I'll ask all the panelists to comment on that. And if you feel like you've already said something, feel free to just pass. But Kanika, we might start with you.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think what continues to lack, and actually this is following Kirsty's point, is that there really seems to be a lack of community insight. And if we are aware that these technologies are going to have a significant impact on those who are marginalized, they should have a say and an understanding of how that is going to impact their lives. And that's the issue and the problem, is the ones who are making the decisions about the use of these technologies continue to be those in power, even though chances are they are not going to be the ones that are going to be impacted by it. So there needs to be meaningful engagement with the public. And what that means is also educating them about what the risks are. Quite often police services and institutions are very secretive about what they use in order for crime control. But if the idea is public safety, the public should be involved in that decision making. Therefore, it's to make this assumption that everybody will be against the use of these technologies is also a bit short-sighted. there might be some individuals who are okay with it if they knew more about it, if there was a level of transparency in its use, like what it is going to be used for, how decision making is being made based on the use of these technologies, and certainly the risks that are associated and the mechanisms that will be in place if we do recognize that this continues to have a significant impact on particular communities. So therefore, I think it's truly important to have community voice at the table and in a meaningful way to have decisions about co-creating policies that are important to their own well-being and their issues of privacy and what the use of these technologies mean to them.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Kanika. We've got a big push in Australia around co-design of policy, and while I'm totally for it, you have to also have venues for re-review by communities. Like once a policy decision is made, we have to open up that space to see what the unintended consequences are. So I think those are really, really valuable points. Jenna, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. And those are really great points that also came up in my research context as well. So something that became starkly clear in my research is, given this evidence of racially targeted repercussions of data governance, racial groups have immense hesitancy of data collection practices and a really strong distrust sometimes of data protection protocols. And of course, alongside transparency and accountability and consulting with these populations who are deeply affected and disproportionately affected, I think it's really important to garner this trust around ideas of privacy. And so I think a really important way that we can do this is we can think of privacy not as a line in the sand, where one side is poor privacy protection and the other side is privacy has been achieved. I think it's really important to think of privacy as shifting and as an active process rather than being a static final goal. So privacy needs to constantly be renegotiated, re-explained, reassessed, and re-regulated.
Great, thanks for that. Renee, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I'm like, for me, like what we need in definitely, I'm like, regulation is like definitely important. We need good regulation because that's what people respond to and kind of the forcing function that the companies do. So without like good regulation in place, I think that can be not great. But it also comes down to governance and like how people interpret that regulation and make use of it in their businesses or the technologies that they use or whatever settings that I'm not sure that there's always enough being done around the governance. So, at the beginning, Kate, you linked in the reference for like Indigenous data sovereignty. And I think there can be a lot that we can learn from people who are trying to explore different types of data governance structures, whether that's collectives or other formats that this may take. I think that's, something like a gender, like a rape crisis center or something smaller that is attending to a really specific issue, that those could be great places to really explore what some of those alternative data governance structures are like, especially when you think about an issue like gender violence, which is about autonomy and agency and, wanting to ensure people have that restored to them. What would it mean to approach privacy from there? And maybe we could learn from those types of experiments and figure out how, if they can even be scaled. I don't know that they can. So I think I, would just love to try to uplift groups and people, communities who are trying to think differently about data governance and see what lessons we can learn from them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Renee. And actually, so in our school, because we do so much work on regulation and governance across different domains, we have different principles and concepts that we kind of instill around how to tackle a complex problem, no matter what context it's in. And what you've described is what we call regulatory experimentation, that has to be preserved and thought through before it can be scaled up. So you've just done Regulatory Studies 101 for everyone. Thanks for that. You could help come teach our courses. Well done. But I think it's really important in this space because, you know, innovations around digital technology are growing at a rate we all can't keep track of, and not all of it's publicly accessible. So working through those things together and tackling that range of issues is a great, great point. Kirsty, I know you've kind of already touched on this in your previous response, but did you have anything else to add around this set of issues?
I think I just would make one quick comment, and that's that we can't, focus on these like data projects in isolation. They are, I guess, embedded in the organizations that, produce them. So I think we need to also ask a broader question about questions of, race and inequity within these organizations. So to return to my last, I guess, example, I would ask climate finance organizations to take a critical look at how they are defining and thinking about the idea of risk, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great, great. So I'm mindful of time, and we've got so many wonderful questions coming in, but what I might do is just ask each of the presenters to kind of give us one take-home point that you think is really important. Maybe we've touched on it already, but if we were to take a lesson around questions of power and privacy and racial inequality, kind of what would you want an audience to take away from that research that you've done? And maybe Kirsty, I'll start with you since you've just started that conversation actually in some ways.
Look, I think maybe the takeaway point from my research is that a critical look into the stories we're telling is really important. And I guess maybe deconstructing and unpacking, these data projects that we think, as Renee really articulately said, we think they're, giving us this objective snapshot into reality. But I think we need to unpack whose story is being told, who's advantaged and who's disadvantaged from, framing the story in this particular way.
Great. And certainly in your case with climate finance, we see a lot of corporate actors entering that space and not necessarily as many communities. Thanks for that. Jenna, any thoughts?
Yeah, so, obviously, as we've discussed today, there's extensive evidence that racial groups have unique data protection concerns, such as over surveillance and targeted policing. But in practice, oftentimes we find that data protection, data security manuals, protocols, guidelines, standards, and ethics don't actually reflect this, and they tend to disregard racial difference. And so basically we're seeing that there's not a discussion of race at all happening in these conversations of privacy at the institutional level, and they don't contain any special protections in terms of privacy as they relate to race. And by not saying or doing anything about race, these omissions actually enable data to uphold racial inequities. And so we want to try to not be projecting this homogenizing, standardized way of thinking about privacy in a way that ignores race, shapes experiences of privacy, and we know that race creates unique risks as they relate to privacy.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Jenna. And actually, we'll pick this up because there's a question about in the Q&A around race and what does race even exist? And I think what your answer has really done is illustrate that race is something that is produced by society. It's not an inherent biological feature of us, but it is a form of inequality that manifests differently in different places, and institutions can actually reproduce it. People can experience it historically over time, and it can become compounded. And when you add data to it, it can actually make it more concrete in ways that we don't even see. So race may not be a biological thing, but as you've described, it's something that is socially produced and something that certainly tends to have power. And when we don't recognize it or discuss it, it can actually have more power than when we, than when we do talk about it. So that's a really excellent point in raising those issues. Kanika, you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, first, that was an excellent point. I just wanted to echo my colleagues in terms of the importance of community and those who are impacted by these technologies to be part of the conversation. So quite often, and what it seems like it continues, these conversations continue to focus on those who are in power. So I see, like, I commend even law enforcement agencies who are making an attempt to be transparent about their use of AI tech, and they will identify individuals that they want on boards and on panels to regulate and to examine these technologies, but it continues to still focus on those who are in power. And quite often as well, it includes institutions that are part of the government, so a government's arm's length. And I question this level of objectivity because very often these institutions are funded by the government themselves. So where is there really going to be a motivation to deviate away from the status quo if it is the government that in essence is funding you, and you are being asked to sit on a panel that may speak to bias and such, but you may not have true autonomy to do so. Therefore, I think it's truly important then to have community voices and to be very meaningful about those who are sitting and looking and examining these texts, as they are the ones that are going to be impacted by it the most.
That's really interesting. We're actually setting up some boards around data governance around some related issues in sport, which, is a really diverse group of stakeholders. And we don't think of sport as one of those spaces where there could be, meaningful consequences, but there are, especially when you're dealing with medical and health data. And one of the things we found is that you need that representation of group, but you also need the technical expertise to be in dialogue with those communities to help explain. And Renee, we might end with you.
Yeah, I don't think we fully touched on this in the panel, but maybe I'll end with a note on privacy, and for everyone in the audience to maybe think about the spaces that you work in, or perhaps have a little bit of power in, or can control, and like, what would it mean to make privacy kind of more meaningful to the people or stakeholders that you work with in those spaces? Like, is it about improving the terms of service, which I think we all know people just kind of click through, you have no choice, and like, and what's that there? So for whatever kind of setting you're in, I think I would just love for folks to like just think or mull over, experiment with what like privacy could look like in those spaces. And I'll end there. I know we have great questions.
Yeah, we do, but that's a great way to kind of conclude the discussion. So thanks, everyone. I might start in order in which they came in, and given the recording may not capture them, I'll also read them so everyone can hear. So our first question, and I won't use anyone's identifiers as well in the names. So our first question, which came in early in the panel around 8:55 in the Q&A, was, a really provocative one about, can bias be removed completely from AI predictive programs, or will there always be a slight risk of bias? And there's also some additional things around historic bias in data used to train AI in different contexts, specifically the police context really raised that. And Renee, I know in your day job, beyond when you hang out with us in our lab, you do a lot of work on this stuff, or at least try to address it. And so maybe I might throw to you to talk about, how can we handle bias in AI predictive programs? But I mean, AI more generally, really, noting that AI is a whole range of things, not just, the way we've described it here. But you would probably be our in-house expert on this.
Oh no, accused of expertise. No, I would definitely, I think this is a great question. And I would say that I don't think that AI predictive programs nor any technology can be completely removed of bias. I think that what we can do is think about the level of bias in a technology and how much have we tried to anticipate, identify, account for, and then kind of be really kind of thoughtful and recognizing that we haven't got it all. And there's so many ways that bias can enter into various like models or algorithms. It could come from the training data. That's a huge source. And we've been talking about how no data is neutral. So there's over and under representations in every data set, whether that's kind of visual data, text data, audio data, it's there. So when we're training models to be used out in the world, it's absorbing those biases there. They might also show up in classification labels that we're using. And then I would love to hear Kanik talk about this as well, but like the social setting in which they're deployed is also full of biases. So you're taking one bias technology and deploying it into another bias technology. And so I think the best thing that we can do is recognize that and try to account for it, address it, be proactive. And also, this shouldn't just be done before these models are released into the world. It needs to continue after as well. There needs to be like continuous monitoring, recognition, because once you put something out into the world, it starts to develop those feedback loops where, you know, if we might take the case of predictive policing, you know, like police are deployed to an area for certain reasons, they're deployed for certain areas. It's creating a little feedback loop. And then when you deploy one of those technologies there, it kind of continues that process.
Yeah, great. And Kanika, I might invite you to join in on this because we've got a second related question around historical bias and data used to train. And Renee, I think you've got a great point here that these technologies continue to learn. So it's not even like they're fixed in stone and what they start with as their bias stays as their bias. It actually can grow. And that's a logic, you know, engineers really would have to deal with, not necessarily us looking in on it. And one solution is not going to happen at the beginning. But Kanika, we've got a couple questions about historic data and practical ways to address it. Renee's touched on some, but I don't know if you have other thoughts you'd want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll be quick with this response. I think just to answer the question in terms of can bias be eliminated? No, I echo exactly what Renee has said. And I think what might be important then is for us to perhaps use this data instead of focusing on police deployment and resources. Maybe we can use this data to demonstrate how historical biases has had an impact on specific populations in our country. So then that can be used to better understand the resources that are needed for individuals within these communities. And that is taking more of a proactive approach. So in order for us not to continue the systemic biases that we are seeing, perhaps we can use this data to address systemic biases and then hopefully not see the same marginalizations, the same oppressions happening with particular communities in our country. And I'm speaking from the Canadian context. So once again, we're starting to have these conversations about the impacts of intergenerational trauma within Indigenous communities. We're starting to have conversations about the impacts of enslavement in Canada and how that has impacted Black peoples in Canada. So when we have that understanding, we then can use the data to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and that these systemic biases that have significantly impacted these populations can then get the resources needed in order to ensure racial equity among all in our country.
Great, thanks. We have another question that came in around 8:59 that builds on the initial question around bias in AI. And it asks, you know, if there will always be some risk of bias, how do we approach this? Like, is transparency is difficult when we think about these self-learning systems. I think we've touched on that a little bit, but maybe Renee, I might invite you to add some, and then maybe also Jenna after that, since I know you've worked with practitioners who try to deal with some of these issues. But Renee, I might throw to you first and then Jenna.
Yeah, this is a great question. So like thinking about training data, I would say that oftentimes people are not fully examining all the biases that might be in their training data set, which might sound surprising, but I find that true in practice. So people might not understand if maybe they may not be able to recognize, especially at scale, if we're thinking about really large data sets, like, is there just a complete absence of people with certain skin tones? Do I know if I have enough representation of people with different genders? If this is like text corporate data, is all my information from like news sources or academic articles? Because that's language written in a certain way that is maybe not spoken or talked in different settings. So every data set will have these, and I don't think that we've yet created a norm where we're examining that. I think, so recognizing the gaps is the first step, and then trying to fill them is the second one. And I think that can be really complicated. Even within the industry context, I think there's this idea that there's just, it can be hard to fill those gaps. And so people are looking to things like, should we use synthetic data to try to address gaps in the trading? Will that introduce new biases? What might be the outcomes of that? I think those are the kinds of in progress questions that people are trying to grapple with. And there's plenty of like kind of scholars, if you're interested in these conversations, like the CHI, that community of kind of social scientists and computer science folks working together to try to think through this. The FACT community, FAACT, that's kind of another kind of forum where people are trying to grappling with this. And I just think we have to recognize that they're open questions, and we will, I think, would just benefit from having more people participate in those questions to get more perspectives to kind of think through together. Because right now there's not a clear answer, but for me, anticipating and recognizing the bias is what we have to do, and have conversations about what that means and where we want to deploy a technology, and if like the costs, if the benefit risks are like worth it, because they might not be, but you have to talk about it.
Yeah, I'm mindful of time. Jenna, do you have a short intervention there, just knowing where you've worked?
Yeah, so AI is used really heavily in the humanitarian sector. And so a way that they're trying to mitigate bias, because actually what's really interesting is they have recognized not only that there's bias baked in and racial bias baked into some of these algorithms that are used, but also that there's racial error. So what I mean by that is you can't measure race with data, you can't categorize days in these easily simplistic ways. And so something that they've done to mitigate the risks of AI is they've offered redress mechanisms or grievance mechanisms. So for instance, if a refugee is misclassified by an AI because, for instance, it doesn't take the host communities pushing them out of their community because they're of a particular skin tone, they can access these redress mechanisms to explain their situation. And so basically what we're seeing here is data can't capture everything. So they're trying to get accounts from the actual people affected and trying to kind of, I wouldn't say triangulate that with the data, but read it alongside the data that they're plugging into the AI to kind of get a more holistic perspective. But basically this just enables more accountability to the population and recognizes, AI does mess up sometimes.
Great, thanks. And we've got about a minute left. I know there's lots more questions, but I might just briefly kind of conclude. I think we've covered a lot on AI. There's some really important questions about, is there good privacy legislation that talks about these issues? And I'd say there's maybe not legislation on the books yet, but there's definitely deep conversations happening. And a lot of that's coming out of Indigenous data sovereignty movements. So I would really encourage folks that are interested in learning more about that to read that text and think with it, because it is talking about privacy in a collective sense. It's talking about historic challenges that have become present, that have carried on into the present, and thinking through what privacy might mean and when and how data should be used to help communities, not necessarily get used in other ways. And then I think I think we've covered most. So maybe we'll just end on that note, because I know everyone else has other panels to go to. So thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner for having us. And thank you to all for amazing questions. We could all stay on for another hour, but I'm sure you all have busy things to do and have other obligations. But thank you again.